Hello, I'm your host, Catherine Jovicic, and welcome to The Inspired Teacher. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which this podcast is recorded, the Yagara and Turrbal peoples of Minyan. I pay my respects to elders past and present and recognise their ongoing connection to the land, waters, and community. Today I want to talk about an excellent example of inclusive practice for culturally and linguistically diverse students. In this 8-cell illustration of practice, a Year 4 teacher uses Aboriginal dreaming stories to support student storytelling for her diverse classroom, which includes many First Nations students. This is an inspiring example because she demonstrates that inclusive, culturally responsive teaching is not just about adding cultural content. It's about adapting pedagogy so students' identities, languages, and prior knowledge can shape learning. The teacher, Frey Lucas, builds learning around students' cultural knowledge, language experiences, and existing understandings. As she reads the dreaming stories aloud, she stops to discuss the meaning of Aboriginal words, explores cultural significance, and prompts students to share their own knowledge and experiences. Students relate their experiences to the storylines, and questioning is used to find out what they already know. This information guides teaching, and she calls it teaching by student knowledge. Hammond explains that culture is how people make sense of the world, and new learning is retained and made more meaningful when it's culturally relevant. Inclusive practice is evidenced not only with the use of dreaming stories in the lesson, but with the teacher's effort to connect parts of the story and new learning to students' own worlds and experiences. Ms. Lucas's practice is also linguistically inclusive, as she undertook a professional development course that focused on the different dialects of Aboriginal English and how they can be incorporated in her classroom. She said putting this knowledge into practice in her own classroom brought out more vocabulary in the literacy experiences leading up to story creation. Research shows that home languages are valuable resources in the classroom and can be used as a bridge to new learning. This teacher's inclusive approach recognises that students bring important cultural and linguistic knowledge with them. The Australian curriculum expects that teachers hold high expectations by considering the abilities and interests of diverse students. This is evident as student culture is treated as an asset, with Miss Lucas focusing on their oral storytelling skills. This is supported by the use of video cameras and USB microphones. Miss Lucas takes a hands-on approach rather than having students sit, listen, and write. And this links to non-verbal from the 8 ways, which involves applying intrapersonal and kinesthetic skills to thinking and learning. Games are incorporated into her teaching, and she notes how well this works for all students, not just her First Nations students. Because she provides culturally responsive alternative ways for students to learn and demonstrate their learning, she creates an inclusive environment where all students can succeed. Within the cross-curriculum priority Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander histories and cultures, under the dimension of people, the aligning organising idea recognises the significant and ongoing contributions of First Nations Australians and their histories and cultures. It shows up in the Year 4 English curriculum as students learn to notice storylines and relationships communicated in First Nations literature across different contexts. When students relate their experiences to the dreaming storylines, the ideas, themes, and relationships become more meaningful. This creates opportunity for discussion and to appreciate that First Nations Australians continue to make significant contributions to literature and culture. Under the dimension of culture, the connected organising idea recognises First Nations Australians' unique ways of being, knowing, thinking, and doing. This is embedded in teaching, as dreaming stories are not just used as isolated cultural resources, they are explored through Aboriginal pedagogies. This aligns with Yunka Porter's argument that Aboriginal perspectives cannot be included through content alone, but through the processes of learning. Aboriginal elders use storytelling to teach, and they prompt learners to reflect and think critically about the meanings within narratives, strongly linking First Nations ways of being, knowing, thinking, and doing. It also appears in the Year 4 English curriculum, where students examine the author's language choices and how they contribute to meaning. For First Nations people, languages carry stories, songlines, cultural knowledge, kinship, spirituality, and ways of knowing, being, and doing. Miss Lucas stops to discuss the author's use of language and how those words help shape meaning. This gives students opportunity to see how those language choices reflect ways of understanding and expressing worldviews. Culturally responsive pedagogy is central to this lesson sequence. Research has shown a strong link between culture and how people learn and think. Yanka Porter talks about learning through culture, which is evident in the use of Aboriginal pedagogies used in these lessons. These approaches can benefit all students through engagement, higher order thinking, confidence, behaviour, and quality of work. By teaching through narrative, this teacher's approach reflects story sharing from the 8 ways. First Nation teaching methods centralise narrative for knowledge transmission, as stories help their students understand meaning, connect learning to real life, and think deeply. Grounding learning in narrative is not only culturally responsive, but it also means that learning is personalised and connected to students' own stories. Aboriginal cultures have strong oral traditions, so when learning is processed using cultural learning tools such as storytelling and dialogue, students have far greater knowledge retention. The story sharing pedagogy is further supported by technology. The incorporation of technology can help students learn in more interactive and efficient ways and support creativity and inclusion. Video and USB microphones enable students to tell their stories orally, refine them, and listen closely to the sounds in words from their own language to support spelling and transcription. This is inclusive not only for First Nations students, but for all students, because it offers them alternative ways to participate, not just one written pathway. This aligns with the Australian curriculum that promotes opportunities for students to engage with learning in different ways. The general capability intercultural understanding is embedded organically into the teacher's pedagogy. Within the element engaging with cultural and linguistic diversity, Level 3 talks about the importance of perspective taking and how the perspectives of others influence how they view the world. When engaging with dreaming stories, students can recognise First Nations perspectives, helping them understand that culture and experience influence how First Nations people interpret texts, relationships, and the world around them. This is evident in the lesson as the teacher pauses reading dreaming stories for questioning and to discuss language and meaning. She asks First Nations students to share their knowledge relating to terms and ideas that come up in the stories. Additionally, home languages are incorporated into teaching, exposing students to the different ways people communicate, so they can move away from thinking standard Australian English is the only way. These pedagogical choices teach students to acknowledge that multiple perspectives exist and they influence how others understand and interact with the world. The digital literacy capability could also be successfully integrated into this learning sequence. The sub-element create, communicate, and collaborate requires that Year 4 students use familiar digital tools to create text in English. Providing Book Creator on iPads would provide another pathway for students to demonstrate their learning, incorporating oral narration, pictures, and text rather than relying on written work. Teachers can also use iPads to differentiate tasks for student needs. Used effectively, iPads can increase engagement, motivation, independence, self-regulation, creativity, and as well develop stronger technology skills. Students see these devices as an essential for 21st century education. The Melbourne Declaration promotes 21st century learners who respect cultural diversity and value Indigenous cultures. This led to the inclusion of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander histories and cultures in the curriculum and can occur in English through storytelling traditions, such as the ones demonstrated in this lesson sequence. Scott describes 21st century dispositions such as social responsibility, cross-cultural sensitivity, and emotional intelligence. The teacher promotes these attributes in an age-appropriate way as she centres Aboriginal dreaming stories, languages, and cultural experiences in her classroom. Scott talks about personalisation in learning as a 21st century pedagogical approach connecting teaching to students. This is evident where Miss Lucas builds learning around cultural strengths, knowledge, and preferences. She provides alternative pathways and processes to cater to the different learning needs of students. Learning is personalised further using Aboriginal pedagogies, which she reports optimises engagement for all her students. Personalisation builds autonomy and motivation, meaning students can take responsibility for their learning. This is important in the 21st century because learners need to think creatively and continue learning throughout their lives. Thank you for listening and please subscribe for more inspiring stories from Australian classrooms.